Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, unable to move? Your body frozen, your mind racing. You try to scream, but no sound escapes. And then, just beyond the edge of the shadows, you feel it. A presence. Watching. Waiting. This is the story of Lily, a college student whose life turned into a waking nightmare. What began as sleepless nights spiraled into something far more sinister. She thought it was all in her head, but she was wrong. It started during midterms. Lily had been staying up late, surrounded by textbooks, empty coffee cups, and the soft hum of her desk lamp. She chalked up her exhaustion to stress. But exhaustion doesn't explain waking up paralyzed. The first night it happened, she woke suddenly. The air in her room felt heavy, like it had been vacuum sealed. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if she had been buried alive in her own skin. Then she noticed it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a shadow in the corner of her room. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized it wasn't just standing. It was swaying like a broken marionette. Her heart raced as the figure began to move, gliding toward her without a sound. Its eyes, two faintly glowing yellow orbs, were locked on hers. Lily tried to scream, but the weight on her chest was crushing. She couldn't even blink. The figure stopped inches from her face. It leaned down, its breath cold and acrid. And then it whispered, "I've always been here." When she woke up, she was drenched in sweat, her lungs heaving as if she'd been drowning. She told herself it was a bad dream. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The paralysis episodes continued, night after night. Each time the figure grew bolder. At first, it stayed in the corner, but soon it was crouching at the foot of her bed. Then it was leaning over her, close enough for her to feel its icy fingers graze her skin. Lily began to notice a pattern. The episodes always happened at the same time, 3:33 a.m. She tried staying awake, but no matter how hard she fought, sleep always came for her. During the day, the shadow followed her. She would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye. Something dark and fast, just beyond her line of sight. One afternoon, she noticed something strange in her apartment. Her notebook, which she always left on her desk, was lying on the floor, its pages crumpled. She picked it up and froze. Scrawled across one of the pages, in faint, jagged lines, was a single word: mine. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination. But the whispers had started during the day, faint and unintelligible, echoing in the stillness. Desperate, Lily turned to a sleep specialist. He listened patiently as she described her experiences. "It's classic sleep paralysis," he explained. "Your brain is awake, but your body hasn't caught up yet. The figures and whispers are just hallucinations, tricks of the mind." But Lily wasn't convinced. "What about the scratches?" she asked, rolling up her sleeve. Her arm was lined with faint red marks, too symmetrical to be accidental. The doctor's expression darkened, but he didn't answer. Out of options, Lily visited a spiritualist. The woman, her apartment thick with the scent of incense, listened intently. When Lily finished, the woman sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You've opened a door," she said. "It might have been a thought, a fear, something you welcomed without knowing it. But now, it is here." The spiritualist handed her an amulet. "This might protect you," she said, "but be careful. Once it attaches to you, it's hard to break free." That night, Lily sat alone in her apartment, clutching the amulet. She tried to remember if she had ever invited something in, and then it hit her. Months earlier, at a party, her friends had been playing with the spirit board. She hadn't taken it seriously, but she remembered laughing as they asked questions into the void. She'd said something as a joke. "If anything's out there, I dare you to come find me." Her chest tightened as the memory resurfaced. She hadn't thought about it since that night, but now she was certain. She had opened the door. The storm arrived just past midnight. Rain lashed against her windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. Lily lit the sage the spiritualist had given her and placed the amulet around her neck. But she couldn't stay awake. Exhaustion pulled her under, and once again she woke at 3:33 a.m. Her room was pitch black. The storm outside seemed to have muffled every sound, and there, at the foot of her bed, was the shadow. This time, it didn't hesitate. It crawled onto her chest, its weight suffocating. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from inside her own head. "You called me. You belong to me." Its fingers wrapped around her neck, cold and sharp like icicles. Lily felt her vision darken. She focused all her energy on moving, on screaming. Slowly, she managed to clench her fist. And then, she screamed. The sound tore through the silence, and the shadow recoiled. For a moment, its form seemed to flicker, like smoke caught in a breeze. Then it vanished. When Lily woke, the storm had passed, but the room was still cold. Her arms bore deep scratches, red and angry. She moved out of the apartment that day, hoping to leave the nightmare behind, but the shadow wasn't done with her. Weeks later, in her new apartment, she woke again at 3:33 a.m. For a moment, the room was silent. And then, from the corner, she heard it, the faint rustling of fabric. Her heart raced as her eyes adjusted to the dark. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of her vision, she saw them, two faintly glowing yellow eyes, watching, waiting. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed.
Ethan had grown used to the monotony of the night shift at the small gas station on the edge of town. The hours dragged on, customers came in sparingly, and the only consistent noise was the flickering buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't exciting, but it was predictable, and that's what Ethan liked about it. But tonight, something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, the silence sharper. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. It clung to him like a shadow, subtle at first but impossible to ignore as the night wore on. A faint beeping from the back broke the spell. Ethan frowned, glancing at the monitor above the counter. The walk-in freezer's temperature had dropped sharply, far below normal. "Not again," he muttered, grabbing his jacket. The freezer was temperamental, and he'd had to reset the thermostat more times than he could count. As he headed toward the back of the store, the dim aisles of chips and candy bars seemed unusually still. The slushy machine hummed softly, but its glow felt faint, like a dying ember in the darkness. The freezer door stood slightly ajar. A thin mist of cold vapor curled into the air, dissipating near Ethan's boots. "Figures," Ethan said under his breath, nudging the door open with his shoulder. The freezer's fluorescent lights buzzed as he stepped inside. Rows of frozen meats, boxed pizzas, and ice cream tubs gleamed under the cold white glow. Everything looked normal, except for one detail. Near the middle of the floor, a single set of footprints disturbed the frost. The prints were deep, fresh, and led to the far corner before abruptly stopping. Ethan's pulse quickened. He crouched, running his fingers across the icy indentations. The size was wrong, too large to be his own, and the spacing was strange, as if whoever made them had taken impossibly long strides. Standing quickly, Ethan tried to laugh it off. "Get it together, man. It's probably, I don't know, condensation or something. He turned to the thermostat and adjusted the dial, his breath misting in the freezing air. His fingers trembled slightly as he worked, though he told himself it was just the cold. The door slammed shut behind him. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Ethan spun around, his heart hammering. He lunged for the handle and yanked, but it didn't budge. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice echoing against the metal walls. "Who's out there?" For a moment, silence. Then he heard it, a faint, deliberate scratching from outside the door. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he leaned closer to the frosted glass panel. Something moved beyond it, a shadow shifting in the dim light of the store. A figure emerged, tall and impossibly thin, with elongated arms that hung like pendulums at its sides. Its head tilted to one side, its silhouette pressing closer to the glass. Ethan's stomach twisted as he noticed its face, or rather, the absence of one. Where features should have been, there was only a blurred, frost-covered void. "Hey! Let me out!" Ethan shouted, pounding on the door. His voice cracked, desperation bleeding into every word. The figure didn't move. It only stared, its tilted head following Ethan's every motion. Ethan fumbled for his phone, his shaking hands barely managing to unlock it. He dialed 911, his thumb slipping on the screen as he tried to hit call. Before he could connect, the freezer lights flickered, and then they went out. The darkness was suffocating. Ethan's phone cast a faint, blue glow, barely enough to see his own trembling hands. He could feel the cold sinking deeper into his bones, but there was something else now. A presence. The scratching sound returned, louder and closer. Then came the voice, a low, raspy whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You shouldn't have come in here." Ethan's scream filled the small space, his voice breaking as he slammed his fists against the door. The cold air felt alive, pressing against him, freezing him in place. The handle suddenly gave way and Ethan stumbled out, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. The store was empty, silent. He staggered to his feet, his breath heaving in his chest. He grabbed his phone and bolted for the front door, not daring to look back. As he fumbled with his keys, he caught something in his peripheral vision, a flicker on the security monitor. On the screen, the freezer door stood open. Inside, a shadow moved. It shifted toward the glass, where 3 jagged words appeared in frost, "Still watching." Ethan didn't wait. He ran. Carl had worked as a night janitor for over 20 years, but no building unsettled him like the old St. Michael's Hospital. Shuttered for a decade, it loomed in the center of town, its darkened windows staring like empty sockets. Some parts of the hospital were still used for storage, but most of it was sealed off, left to rot. Carl didn't mind the isolation. In fact, he liked the quiet. It gave him time to think as he pushed his mop through the endless halls. But there was one place he refused to go, the 13th floor. Officially, it didn't exist. St. Michael's blueprint skipped from the 12th to the 14th floor, likely to appease superstitious patients. But Carl knew better. He'd heard the whispers among the older staff. Somewhere, hidden in the labyrinth of the hospital, there was a forgotten space, a floor that wasn't supposed to be there. It was just a story. At least that's what Carl told himself. The shift started like any other. Carl swept the lobby, his broom scraping against the cracked marble floors. Outside, a storm raged, and rain lashed against the tall windows in frantic bursts. As he rounded the corner near the elevators, he stopped short. One of the elevator panels was glowing. Carl frowned. The elevator hadn't worked in years, its system long since disconnected. Yet the panel blinked faintly, its light feeble but unmistakable. He stepped closer, the glow illuminating the button for the 13th floor. His mouth went dry. That button wasn't supposed to exist. For a long moment, Carl stared at it, his pulse quickening. Finally shaking his head, he muttered, "Not tonight," and turned to leave. Behind him, the elevator doors slid open with a low groan. Carl froze. Slowly, he turned back. The elevator waited, its fluorescent bulb flickering weakly. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the sour smell of mildew. His legs felt like they moved on their own as he stepped inside. The doors closed behind him with a soft thunk. The control panel glowed faintly. His finger hovered over the buttons, hesitating. Before he could decide, the elevator jolted, lurching upward. Carl stumbled, gripping the handrail as the numbers above the door ticked by, 10, 11, 12. The elevator shuddered to a stop. The panel read 13. The doors creaked open. A dark hallway stretched before him, damp and decaying. The walls were lined with peeling floral wallpaper, sagging with moisture. The air was thick and metallic, carrying a faint undercurrent of rot. Carl stepped out cautiously, his boots squelching on the sodden carpet. A faint hum buzzed in the distance, rhythmic and uneven. He thought he heard a whisper, faint but insistent, like someone just out of sight. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. Silence. He took another step, his heartbeat loud in his ears. That's when he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It sounded like fingernails drumming against glass. Carl turned a corner and froze. At the end of the hallway stood a figure. It was shadowy and indistinct, its shape eerily similar to Carl's own. The figure didn't move, but Carl could feel its presence, its gaze heavy and unnatural. The tapping stopped. "Who's there?" Carl whispered, though he wasn't sure he wanted an answer. The figure tilted its head, mirroring Carl's movement. Slowly, it raised an arm, pointing toward a door to Carl's left. Carl hesitated. His entire body screamed for him to turn and run, but his legs refused to obey. He moved toward the door, as though pulled by an unseen force. The door was ajar. Through the gap, a flicker of dim light spilled into the hallway. Carl pushed it open, revealing a small, windowless room. The walls were covered in deep scratches, as though something had clawed at them for years. In the center of the room sat a single chair, facing a cracked mirror. That's when Carl heard it, his own voice. "Why did you come here?" The whisper echoed, cold and sharp. Carl's breath caught. He turned to the mirror, his reflection staring back, but the chair in the reflection was empty. Then, in the mirror's distorted glass, he saw it. Behind him stood the figure. Its face was a blurred void, yet Carl could feel it grinning. It leaned close, its breath cold against his neck. "You shouldn't have come here." Carl screamed, stumbling backward. The door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. When Carl woke, he was lying on the lobby floor. The storm outside had calmed, the rain now a soft patter against the windows. Disoriented, he staggered to his feet. His mop lay nearby, and the elevator doors were open, revealing only the dark, empty shaft. He never spoke of what happened that night, but every now and then, while cleaning the 12th floor, he could hear it. The faint, rhythmic tapping. And sometimes, when passing the elevator, he swore he saw the button for the 13th floor, glowing faintly. Waiting. Tyler didn't mind the isolation of working as a night security guard at the remote logistics warehouse. It was quiet, predictable, and far from the chaos of his old job in the city. The warehouse sat at the edge of a sprawling forest, miles from the nearest town. Most nights were uneventful. Tyler would sip his coffee, monitor the dimly glowing security screens, and occasionally patrol the vast lot that surrounded the warehouse. But the forest always made him uneasy. There were rumors about those woods. Truck drivers passing through told stories of strange shapes moving between the trees, of hunters who went in and never came back. Tyler dismissed it as small-town superstition, but some nights when the wind howled through the trees, he'd find himself watching the tree line a little too long. The night began like any other. Tyler sat in his cramped office, the rhythmic hum of the monitors filling the air. Outside, a storm was brewing, the wind rattling the window above his desk. As he leaned back in his chair, Sipping lukewarm coffee, the motion detector alarm chimed softly. He frowned and glanced at the monitors. Camera 7, which covered the lot's back corner near the forest, showed movement. The image was grainy, but there was something there, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods. Its silhouette was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its stance slightly off balance. Tyler squinted at the screen. What the hell? Grabbing his flashlight, he stepped outside. The cold night air hit him like a slap, carrying the earthy smell of rain-soaked ground. The wind whistled through the lot, bending the chain-link fence that bordered the forest. He scanned the area, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. Rows of stacked pallets and parked delivery trucks gleamed under the faint glow of the security lights. Then he saw it. At the tree line, just beyond the fence, the shadowy figure stood motionless. It was impossibly still, yet Tyler felt its gaze pressing on him, heavy and suffocating. "Hey, this is private property," Tyler called, his voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't respond. The security lights flickered, casting the lot into near darkness. Tyler's heart raced as his flashlight beam wavered. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. Back in his office, Tyler locked the door and stared at the monitors. He told himself it was just an animal, a trick of the shadows, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. Then, just after midnight, the alarm chimed again. Tyler's stomach sank. Camera 4, which covered the employee entrance near the center of the lot, showed movement. Zooming in, he saw the figure again. It was closer now, standing just beyond the light's reach. Its body shifted unnaturally, as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Tyler grabbed the radio, but his voice caught in his throat. Who could he call? What could he say? The screen flickered, static distorting the image. For a brief moment, the figure seemed to turn its head, tilting it at an impossible angle. Then the camera went black. Tyler didn't want to go outside, but he couldn't stay in the office. The thought of being trapped there with that thing outside was worse. He grabbed his flashlight, his radio, and a wrench from the supply closet, anything to make him feel less vulnerable. The lot was eerily silent, the storm having passed. Rainwater pooled in the cracked asphalt, reflecting the dim glow of the security lights. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence pressed down on him. Then came the sound, a faint rustling from the woods, followed by a low guttural scrape, like nails dragging against metal. Tyler froze, his flashlight beam sweeping across the fence. The trees swayed gently, their rain-soaked branches glistening. Then the shadow moved. It stepped out from the tree line, its elongated limbs jerking unnaturally, like a marionette controlled by shaky hands. Tyler's breath caught as it moved closer, each step slow and deliberate. The figure had no face, no discernible features, yet Tyler felt its eyes boring into him. "Why do you run?" a voice whispered, soft and cold, carried by the wind. Tyler stumbled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp. It hit the ground with a clatter, the beam spinning wildly before landing on the figure's feet. It was only a few yards away now. Tyler turned and bolted, his boots splashing through puddles as he sprinted back to the office. He slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing into his chair. Tyler didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, gripping the wrench tightly, his eyes glued to the monitors. The shadow didn't appear again. When dawn finally broke, he stepped outside cautiously. The lot was empty, the forest silent. But as he walked toward his car, something caught his eye near the edge of the woods. Pressed into the muddy ground were footprints, long, deep, and inhuman. They led from the tree line to the lot and back again. Tyler quit the next day. He never returned to the warehouse, but sometimes, late at night, he thought about the shadow at the edge of the woods. He swore he could see it in his dreams, a flickering shape just out of reach. And sometimes when he looked out his window, he thought he saw it again, watching him from the dark. In the remote village of Frosthaven, where winter's grip felt eternal, New Year's Eve was both a celebration and a shadowed tradition. The townsfolk prepared as they always did, stringing dim fairy lights along snow-laden rooftops and setting up wooden stalls in the square. The centerpiece of the festivities, however, was the ancient clock tower that loomed over the town like a vigilant specter. Built centuries ago, its iron bell had rung in every new year, yet it carried a chilling weight, a curse whispered across generations. Clara tightened her scarf against the biting wind as she stepped out of the frost-crusted cab. It had been years since she last visited Frosthaven, her childhood home, but the place felt as foreign as the dreams she often had of it, familiar, yet wrong. Her parents had passed away when she was young, leaving her in the care of an aunt who had moved them far from the town. Now, as the executor of her late aunt's will, Clara had returned to tie up loose ends, sell the old family home, and, she hoped, find some kind of closure. The streets were quieter than she remembered, the people sullen, as if wary of what lay ahead that night. Even as they exchanged New Year's pleasantries, their glances darted toward the clock tower's shadow. It loomed tall and gray against the snow-blanketed horizon, its face obscured by frost, but its spire piercing the sky. "Still standing, huh?" Clara muttered to herself, her breath clouding in the icy air. A shopkeeper nearby overheard and gave her a sharp look. "It always stands," he said in a low voice, his words as much a warning as an answer. He nodded toward the clock tower. "Just keep clear of it tonight. Midnight's not for everyone." Confused but too tired to pry, Clara offered a weak smile and trudged toward the family home at the edge of town. The house stood untouched by time, its shutters sagging slightly, but the charm of her childhood memories still lingering in its creaking walls. Yet as she stepped inside, a sense of unease prickled at her. On the kitchen table was an envelope, addressed to her in shaky, ink-streaked handwriting. To Clara, "At midnight, the truth tolls. Come to the clock tower. They'll come for you, just as they did for the others." Her stomach churned as she read and reread the words. Who had written it? And what did it mean, the others? The memory of Frosthaven's oldest legend crawled back to her mind, unbidden but persistent. As a child, she'd heard whispers about the clock tower's curse. They said that if you stood too close as the 12th toll echoed on New Year's Eve, you wouldn't live to see the morning. People vanished, gone without a trace. For years, she had dismissed it as a silly superstition, a story meant to scare unruly children. But now, holding the letter, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something very real and very dangerous was tethered to that clock tower. Clara's mind swirled as she sat at the old wooden table, staring at the letter. The ink, slightly smudged, seemed fresh, as if it had been written not long ago. She tried to recall the townsfolk who might still remember her, neighbors, old family friends, but the names escaped her like smoke. What unsettled her most was the mention of the others. Determined to brush off the unease, Clara went upstairs to unpack. Yet even as she busied herself, the words of the note lingered. Every creak of the house made her glance toward the staircase. Every gust of wind rattling the windows made her heart race. By the time night fell, she'd convinced herself that the note was a prank, perhaps from a bored teenager who'd heard she was back in town. She lit a fire in the hearth and sat in the living room, watching the flames dance. The warmth did little to soothe her, though. Her gaze kept drifting to the clock tower, its shadow stretching long and dark over the village. Just before 11, the sound of footsteps outside startled her. She jumped to her feet, peering through the frosted window. A figure stood on the snow-dusted path leading to her door. They wore a thick coat and hat, their face obscured, but something about their stillness made Clara's skin crawl. Before she could decide whether to confront them or hide, the figure turned and walked away, their footprints vanishing into the night. Clara felt the letter in her pocket, the edges crumpled, where her fingers had unconsciously gripped it. By 11:45, she couldn't resist any longer. She grabbed her coat, slipped the letter into her pocket, and stepped into the icy night. The town was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of her boots on the snow. The closer she got to the square, the louder the wind seemed to howl, as if warning her to turn back. When she reached the clock tower, it loomed even taller than she remembered. The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, creaking with the wind. Clara hesitated. She glanced back at the empty streets, then up at the tower's face. The clock read 11:55. A cold dread settled over her as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior of the clock tower was dimly lit by moonlight streaming through cracked windows. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of rust and decay stung her nose. Clara's breath puffed in white clouds as she climbed the narrow spiral staircase, her boots echoing against the stone. About halfway up, she spotted something on one of the landings, a pile of belongings. She knelt to examine them, her heart pounding as she realized they were personal items, scarves, hats, gloves, all left behind as if abandoned in haste. Her breath hitched when she saw a faded photograph among the items. It was of a family, parents, and a young boy. She recognized the boy immediately. It was Oliver, a childhood friend who had vanished one New Year's Eve when they were 8. The town had searched for weeks, but found nothing. Clara's pulse raced. She stuffed the photograph into her pocket and continued upward. At the top of the stairs, she entered the bell chamber. The giant iron bell loomed above her, its surface etched with strange, swirling markings. The clock mechanism clicked and whirred, its gears grinding toward midnight. A chill swept through the room that had nothing to do with the cold. "Clara," a voice whispered. She spun around, but no one was there. The chamber was empty. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. A faint, ghostly figure emerged from the shadows. It was Oliver, his face pale and eyes hollow, as if he were only half there. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice echoing like the wind. Clara stumbled back, her spine pressing against the cold stone wall. The apparition of Oliver flickered like a weak flame, translucent and fragile. His face was locked in the same innocence she remembered from childhood, but his hollow gaze carried a weight far beyond his years. "Oliver," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, more forcefully this time. His form wavered as though the wind itself threatened to scatter him. "It knows you're here. It's already begun." Clara's knees buckled, her mind racing. "What's begun? Oliver, what happened to you? What happened to the others?" Before he could answer, the clock's gears groaned, louder now, echoing in the small chamber. The minute hand crept closer to 12. Oliver glanced toward the bell, his expression twisting with fear. "Get out, Clara!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a scream. "Run before the 12th toll! You can still escape!" The words barely registered before a deafening clang filled the room. The bell struck its first toll, and the air seemed to shatter like glass. Clara clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound vibrated through her skull, drowning out her thoughts. Oliver was gone. The second toll echoed, and the room grew colder, frost creeping up the walls. Shadows poured in through the cracks in the tower, twisting and writhing like living things. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as she realized the shadows weren't just moving, they were watching her. She turned to flee, but the staircase had vanished. The doorway leading down was now a solid wall of stone, as if the tower itself had sealed her in. The third toll rang, and the shadows grew arms, legs, faces. They were human yet distorted, their features stretched and wrong, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. Clara pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. "Why are you doing this?" she screamed, her voice cracking. A whisper answered her, soft but menacing, carried on the icy wind. The curse must be fed. The fourth and fifth tolls sounded in quick succession. Clara's body felt heavier with each chime, as though the air itself was pressing down on her. The shadows advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. One reached for her, its elongated fingers brushing her arm, and a searing cold shot through her veins. Panic overtook her. She searched the room desperately, her eyes landing on the bell's massive mechanism. The gears clicked relentlessly, counting down to midnight. Clara realized she had one chance, to stop the clock before the 12th toll. The 6th toll boomed as she scrambled to the bell's base, searching for a way to jam the gears. The shadows were closing in, their forms solidifying with each chime. She grabbed a loose iron rod from the floor and shoved it into the spinning gears. Sparks flew, and the mechanism groaned in protest, but the gears didn't stop. The 7th toll rang out, and Clara felt the shadows gauge, icy breath on her neck. She spun around, swinging the rod wildly. It passed through the creatures without resistance, as though they were made of smoke. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. The 8th and 9th tolls reverberated, the sound vibrating through her bones. Clara's vision blurred, the room warping around her. She thought of Oliver, of the photo she had found, of the countless others who had vanished. Their fates had been sealed because no one had stopped the curse. The 10th toll came, and with it a voice, low, guttural, and ancient. "Sacrifice or surrender, choose." Clara hesitated, the rod trembling in her hands. She thought of her aunt, of her family's connection to this cursed place. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her family had kept the clock tower running. They had been its guardians, its enablers. The 11th toll rang, louder than all the others, shaking the tower to its foundation. Clara gritted her teeth, tears streaming down her face. "No more," she whispered. She lunged at the gears, shoving her arm into the grinding mechanism. Pain exploded as the gears ground to a halt, the bell falling silent mid-toll. The shadows froze, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. For a moment there was only silence. Clara collapsed to the ground, clutching her mangled arm. She stared at the bell, now lifeless, its surface cracked. The clock's face had stopped at 11:59. But the silence didn't last. A faint whisper rose from the air, a promise laced with malice. "It will toll again." The room dimmed, and Clara's vision faded as she slumped against the stone. Somewhere in the distance, the wind carried the sound of faint, mocking laughter. When the villagers came the next morning, the clock tower door stood wide open. Inside, they found no sign of Clara, only a broken clock, an iron rod wedged between its gears, and the faint smell of burning. The curse had been silenced for now, but in Frosthaven, legends never truly die.
The clock struck a little past midnight as Takashi, a seasoned taxi driver, began his usual late-night shift. The streets of Ishinomaki, Japan, were deserted, blanketed in a silence so heavy it seemed to press against his chest. It had been like this since the devastating 2011 tsunami, which left scars on the land and on the people who remained. Takashi navigated his taxi down a narrow avenue, the dim glow of the streetlights barely piercing the fog that had begun to settle. His focus wavered when he noticed a figure standing at the edge of the sidewalk. A young woman was timidly waving for a ride. She wore a plain white dress that seemed slightly damp, as though caught in a lingering mist, and her long hair clung to her shoulders as if it hadn't yet dried. The street she stood on was notorious for being deserted at this hour, which made her presence all the more unsettling. He pulled the taxi to a slow stop, the hum of the engine breaking the oppressive quiet, and rolled down the window. "Good evening. Where to?" he asked, forcing a polite smile even as a chill traced the back of his neck. "To Ishinomaki Station, please," she replied softly. Her voice was faint, almost swallowed by the night, yet it carried a strange weight, a sadness he couldn't place. Takashi hesitated. Everyone knew the station was in ruins, abandoned since the tsunami had torn through it. Who would go there, especially at this hour? Despite his reservations, he unlocked the door. The young woman slid into the back seat, her movements silent, as if she didn't disturb the air around her. A faint, salty scent filled the car, like the ocean on a stormy day. As Takashi drove, he kept glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her profile lit faintly by the passing streetlights. Her expression was distant, as though she were watching something no one else could see. The ride to the station wasn't long, but the silence between them stretched unnaturally, wrapping around Takashi's thoughts like a heavy fog. Then, without turning her head, she spoke. "Am I dead?" Her voice was soft, but the words struck Takashi like a thunderclap. His grip tightened on the wheel, his knuckles white as panic surged through him. The rearview mirror reflected her gaze. She was looking at him now, her eyes dull, almost lifeless. He blinked. In the instant it took to refocus, she was gone. Takashi's breath hitched. He slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement as the car jerked to a halt. Heart pounding, he twisted in his seat, his eyes scanning the back seat. It was empty, completely empty. The faint scent of salt still hung in the air, as though mocking him. Shaking, Takashi fumbled for his phone but stopped short. Who would believe him? He glanced around the road, hoping to see her figure retreating into the darkness, but the street was still and empty, bathed in eerie quiet. In the days that followed, Takashi shared his experience with other taxi drivers. To his growing unease, several of them recounted similar encounters. Passengers who vanished mid-ride. Figures who requested to go to places that no longer existed, all with the same faint, salty scent lingering after they disappeared. Since that night, Takashi has avoided driving near Ishinomaki Station. Yet, on particularly quiet nights, when the world feels heavy and still, he sometimes hears a whisper carried on the wind. "Am I dead?" The warm glow of São Paulo's city lights faded behind Carlos as his silver Toyota Corolla rolled into the quieter outskirts. The clock on his dashboard blinked 1:12 a.m., the time when the streets seemed to hold their breath, leaving only whispers of life behind. Carlos had worked as an Uber driver for 3 years and had grown used to the strange energy of late-night shifts, but tonight something felt wrong. His phone pinged, startling him. A new ride request had come in. The pickup location was a small park on the edge of town, known more for its graffiti-covered benches and overgrown weeds than for being a spot anyone would visit after dark. Carlos hesitated but tapped accept. A job was a job. The park loomed ahead, shrouded in faint mist, its entrance marked by a flickering street lamp. Carlos slowed the car, peering through the windshield. A tall figure emerged from the shadows. He wore a black hooded sweatshirt, the fabric blending seamlessly with the darkness around him. His slow, deliberate strides carried an unsettling weight. Carlos rolled down the passenger side window slightly. "Are you João?" he asked, his voice steady, though his fingers gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. The man nodded, his face partially obscured by the hood. Without a word, he opened the back door and slid into the seat. The door closed with a soft, almost deliberate click. Carlos glanced at the man through the rearview mirror. The hood still cast shadows over most of his face, but his eyes gleamed faintly, catching the dim light, and they were locked on Carlos. "Where to?" Carlos asked, his voice tighter than before. "Estrada Velha," the man murmured. His voice was low and gravelly, carrying a chill that settled in the car. Carlos's stomach tightened. Estrada Vella was an old, winding road leading out of the city and into a stretch of abandoned farmland. Few people went there, and those who did rarely had good intentions. The app confirmed the destination, so Carlos had no choice but to comply. He put the car in drive, the engine's hum filling the uneasy silence. The man didn't speak again, but Carlos felt his presence like a weight pressing on his back. Through the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of the man's eyes, unblinking, watching. Carlos tried to focus on the road, but every shadow seemed alive. Every turn an opportunity for something to leap out. After a few miles, he broke the silence, hoping to dispel the tension. "Estrada Vella, huh? Not many people go out there. Do you live nearby?" The man didn't respond. Instead, his lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't friendly, it was knowing. Carlos's grip on the wheel tightened as a bead of sweat slid down his temple. The road grew darker, the city lights now a distant memory. Trees lined the path, their twisted branches forming skeletal arches overhead. The headlights barely pierced the dense shadows, and the occasional rustle of leaves seemed unnaturally loud. Then, the man leaned forward, his hood slipping back slightly to reveal his face. Carlos saw him clearly now, sharp cheekbones, pale skin, and eyes so dark they seemed endless. A slow, unsettling grin spread across his face, revealing teeth that gleamed unnaturally white. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he whispered, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. Carlos's heart pounded. Without thinking, he slammed the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The car jerked to a halt in the middle of the deserted road. His chest heaved as he turned to face the man. The back seat was empty. Carlos's breath caught in his throat. He flicked on the interior light, his hands trembling. The seatbelt lay neatly coiled, untouched. A faint scent of cologne lingered. Sharp, almost metallic. His eyes darted around the darkened road, half expecting to see the man standing just beyond the reach of the headlights. But there was nothing. Only the stillness of the night. On the seat where the man had sat, Carlos noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small scrap of paper. His shaking hands reached for it. Written in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "I'll see you again." Carlos didn't finish his shift that night. He sped back toward the city, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds, the faint smell of cologne still clinging to the air. For weeks after, he refused to drive past midnight, haunted by the man's grin and the chilling promise on the note. Even now, Carlos swears that when he glances in the rearview mirror for too long, he catches the faintest glimmer of eyes watching him from the shadows. It was a quiet Thursday night when Javier got the call. His taxi, a well-worn black Nissan Altima, sat idling outside the city hospital, the glow of its dashboard lights reflecting on his weary face. The faint hum of fluorescent lamps buzzed above, blending with the occasional chirp of distant crickets. For Javier, this was routine. Late-night hospital pickups were common. Patients discharged, exhausted doctors heading home, or visitors too drained to drive themselves. But tonight felt different. The radio crackled. "Passenger waiting at the main entrance," the dispatcher announced. Javier sighed, shifting into drive and rolling toward the glass doors of the hospital lobby. Under the dim light stood a woman. She appeared in her late 30s, her blue dress and white cardigan slightly rumpled, as if she'd been sitting for hours. Her dark hair framed a pale face with soft features, but her eyes, they held a sadness that seemed to echo through the night. She carried nothing with her, save for a silver pendant resting on her chest, catching the light with every slight movement. Javier rolled down the passenger side window. "Taxi?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, please. Can you take me to 14 Elm Street?" Her voice was soft, calm, but carried an inexplicable weight. "Sure," he replied, unlocking the back door. She climbed in gracefully, closing the door with a quiet finality. Almost immediately, a faint scent of lavender filled the car, soothing but strangely persistent. Javier started the engine and pulled away from the hospital. The route was simple, a straight shot to a quiet suburban neighborhood, but the air in the car felt heavier with every passing mile. Attempting to lighten the mood, he glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Long night?" She smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. "You could say that," she replied. Her tone was polite but distant, as if she were answering a question asked in a dream. "You're my first fare in a while," Javier continued, trying again. "Most people don't chat much at this hour. I guess I'm used to the quiet." Her smile deepened, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're kind," she said. "Not everyone would notice." Her response unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. He turned his focus back to the road. For the rest of the ride, she sat in silence, her hands resting on her lap, her presence oddly soothing, yet unnervingly still. When they arrived at 14 Elm Street, Javier slowed the car and turned to speak. "We're here," he said, but the words caught in his throat. The back seat was empty. His heart pounded as his eyes darted to the door locks. They hadn't clicked. The seatbelt lay untouched. Yet, she was gone. Javier stepped out of the car, his legs shaky, and looked at the house. Its windows were dark, the lawn overgrown, the paint peeling from years of neglect. Hesitantly, he approached and knocked. Moments later, the porch light flickered on, and an elderly woman opened the door. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes carried a sorrow that made Javier's stomach tighten. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Sorry to bother you," Javier stammered, holding up the pendant. "A woman I picked up said this was her stop. She left this in my car." The woman's face paled. Her hand reached for the pendant, trembling as she took it. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched it tightly. This belonged to my daughter," she whispered. "She passed away 2 years ago. She loved lavender." Javier's breath hitched, the realization chilling him to the core. I didn't mean to upset you," he murmured, stepping back. The woman shook her head, her lips trembling into a faint smile. "Number?" "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. She must have wanted me to have this back. Javier nodded, unable to find the right words. As he returned to his car, he noticed the lavender scent lingering stronger now, almost as if the air itself was holding on to her memory. He drove away, his hands trembling on the wheel, his mind racing. For weeks, the experience haunted him. He avoided the hospital at night, unable to shake the feeling of her presence. But even now, on still evenings when the city sleeps and the world feels heavy, he swears he catches a whiff of lavender in the air. And sometimes when he glances in the rearview mirror, he thinks he sees her reflection. A soft smile, her eyes watching over him, just for a moment, before fading into the shadows. The forest was alive with shadows, their long fingers stretching across the path as the sun sank below the horizon. The Ash Grove Trail was as beautiful as it was remote. A perfect escape, Aaron had thought. But now, with only the sound of his boots crunching on the leaves, he wasn't so sure. Aaron adjusted the straps of his faded Osprey pack, the weight pressing against his shoulders. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Not his co-workers, Not even his ex-girlfriend Claire, who had begged him to find a better way to clear his head. Solitude had sounded ideal after months of stress. But this kind of silence, the kind that seemed to press against his chest, amplifying every heartbeat, was different. The Ash Grove Trail was infamous. People whispered about disappearances, though no one had proof. Just stories. Aaron had dismissed them as nonsense, urban legends designed to scare off rookies. Now, though, he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than he liked. He quickened his pace, hoping to make camp before nightfall. That's when he saw it. A red backpack sat upright in the middle of the trail, its vibrant color stark against the muted browns and greens of the forest floor. Aaron stopped, frowning. It wasn't just the backpack, it was how out of place it looked. Clean, almost pristine, as if someone had set it down just moments before. "Hello?" he called, his voice hesitant. The forest seemed to inhale his words, swallowing them whole. He scanned the trees for any sign of movement, but saw only shadows. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer. The bag looked expensive, a North Face. Aaron knelt beside it, the straps warm against his fingers despite the evening chill. Unzipping it felt wrong, like opening someone's diary. But curiosity won. Inside, he found 3 items: a leather-bound journal, the edges warped and stained, a Polaroid photograph, the trail in the picture uncannily similar to the one he was on now, a small, dented tin box. The air around him felt colder, sharper. Aaron zipped the bag shut and stood, his stomach twisting with unease. Later, by the firelight, Aaron opened the journal. The pages smelled damp, the ink smudged in places. The handwriting belonged to someone named Emily, her words spiraling from calm observations to panicked scrawls. The trail is beautiful, quiet, but it's the kind of quiet that makes you feel watched. Aaron flipped forward, his fingers trembling. Something's wrong. I hear whispers at night, like voices carried on the wind. I thought it was my mind playing tricks, but today I found footprints around my tent. I'm not alone. The entries became erratic, the writing jagged. It's not just the forest. It's in the ground, the trees, the air, everywhere. I think it's following me. No, I know it is. Aaron's hands shook as he closed the journal. He couldn't explain why, but he felt it too, that sense of being watched. He glanced at the Polaroid. The trail in the photo wasn't just familiar. It was ahead of him, a clearing he'd passed earlier. The fire crackled, but the warmth did nothing to ease Aaron's nerves. He tried to convince himself it was just a story, the ravings of a scared hiker, and yet, when he heard a twig snap in the distance, he froze. "Hello?" he called again, his voice shaking. No answer. Only the whisper of leaves in the wind, or was it the wind? Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the clearing in the Polaroid. When he reached it, the sight made his blood run cold. A wooden post stood in the center, weathered and cracked. Pinned to it was a missing persons flyer, the corners curling with age. The face on the flyer was Emily's. Aaron's throat tightened. The date on the flyer matched the last entry in her journal. Aaron turned back toward his camp, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The forest had changed. The trees seemed taller, their branches clawing at the sky. Shadows shifted just beyond the beam of light, and the whispers were louder now, distinct. "Don't look, don't turn around." Aaron's breath came in short, sharp gasps. He stumbled forward, desperate to put distance between himself and the clearing. But when he reached his campsite, he stopped dead in his tracks. The red backpack was there, sitting in the middle of the trail where he'd first found it. The air seemed to vibrate, heavy with an unnatural energy. Aaron's legs felt like lead as he approached the backpack. The tin box inside the bag called to him, and against every instinct screaming in his head, he opened it. Inside was a tarnished locket and a lock of hair, brittle and gray. The moment his fingers brushed the locket, the forest dissolved around him. He was in another place. A vision. Emily stood in the clearing, surrounded by shadowy figures, their faces obscured, but their forms human-like. They whispered in unison, their voices low and guttural. Emily screamed, her hands clawing at the ground, but the figures closed in, pulling her into the earth itself. The vision shattered, and Aaron was back in the forest, gasping for air. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. Aaron didn't remember how he made it out. When the search party found him the next morning, he was curled in a fetal position, clutching the locket. His words were incoherent, something about whispers, shadows, and a red backpack. The backpack was never found. Weeks later, a hiker on the Ash Grove Trail reported finding a red North Face backpack sitting upright in the middle of the path. And the whispers began again.